Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about how to turbocharge your remote studio's productivity. Now, maintaining productivity for any studio is absolutely essential, but studios that have transitioned over to a remote setup over the past few years now face new challenges in keeping teams productive and healthy. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing some of these challenges, interesting benefits that come from a remote setup, and how the core solution to addressing growing pains of going full remote is closer than you think. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Masao Kobayashi. How's it going today?
Pretty good. I really can't complain. How are you doing?
I'm doing great myself, and just really excited to have you here today because there's lots of fun things that we're going to be talking about, important things that we're going to be talking about. But first, for those of you who aren't familiar with Masao, he is the co-founder and producer at Cut2Bits, and him and his team are currently working on their debut title of Venture to the Vial. Masao, can you do me a favor and just quickly share with us what this game is about? It looks really interesting, and there's so many. You know what? I'm just going to let you share what it's about because it looks really cool. So please, what is Venture to the Vial?
So Venture to the Vial is a 2.5D Metroidvania set. Sorry. Venture to the Vial is a 2.5D Metroidvania set in a fantasy world heavily influenced by Victorian themes. So what does 2.5D mean? So it's a 2D platformer, but it's made in a 3D environment. So we actually allow the player to kind of navigate through the world, mostly in 2D, but you can also go into the foreground or into the background, which kind of gives you more of a kind of a 3D navigation to the world in some sense. It's really hard to describe. Like whenever we write it down or like describe it, people are like, what are you talking about? But as soon as people see it on the video, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's what we're working on. It's coming out next year. We have a Steam page, so you can wishlist it if you want to hear more about it. Yeah, it's been pretty exciting.
Yeah, and you guys, I believe, are either, you have an upcoming Kickstarter for the game as well, too. And I believe that will be live around the time that this episode airs. So for those of you listening, definitely check out the Kickstarter page that they have going by the same name, Venture to the Vial. And, check out the Steam page, too, because everything that Masao just described, you get a little bit more clarity when you look at it, and when you watch the trailer and everything else. Not only do you see exactly what he's saying, but you'll be like, "Oh, that's pretty cool. That's pretty impressive." So they're doing a lot of cool things there, and we're going to talk about some of those cool things as it relates to our topic in a moment. But before we do that, some other things I just wanted to share with you folks about Masao. He's worked at Ubisoft for over 13 years. Primarily as a production manager on various projects. I mean, it includes things from like Far Cry, Rainbow Six Siege, just to name a couple. And there's some really remarkable achievements worth mentioning. In 2022 is named one of Game Awards' Future Class, which is such an astonishing accomplishment and everything else. It's glad that you can be part of those awesome people in that and recognized for everything that you've been doing in that front. You've been featured in numerous podcast episodes and lots of other things talking about cool, important conversations needed to have in the industry, and also Cut2Bits. This is the thing that really is, I think, important to me. Is you guys are really focused on increasing industry inclusivity in various ways, such as like providing mentorships, diversity, podcasts, and more. So If you don't mind, could you share us a little bit more about what your studio is doing to really give back to the industry, to the community, in these facets?
So we do a bunch of different things in terms of so okay. A few things. One is mentorships. So I do mentorships through organizations like Code Coven and Pixels locally in Montreal, as well as people I talk to privately as well. And I specifically mentor people who are people of color or marginalized genders within the community, because they definitely get less opportunities than I think other people.
Mm.
I also ran a podcast, interview podcast, talking to other Asian diaspora game devs to talk about kind of the Asian identity and the different facets of it. So, people have a better idea of what it means to be Asian and working in the Western world, and how our identity intersects with kind of, living where we are not the majority.
Mm.
And other than that, I also run a Discord for indie producers to discuss, to talk about producery things and kind of share our knowledge and try to help people. And in terms of what our company is doing internally, we are now a fully remote studio. I mean, technically, I guess we're hybrid because I'm in the studio right now, and we don't actively discourage people from showing up here, but for the most part, everybody works from home. A lot of people, ever since the pandemic, we specifically started hiring internationally. Because trying to find local talent was very difficult. And since we weren't in person anyway, we figured like, well, why bother trying to find somebody locally when there are so many people around the world who have a lot less opportunity than the people in Montreal. So most of our hires since then have been international. We work with people from around the world, including Spain, not Spain, Sweden, Scotland, Mexico, Brazil, and the United States. And our publishers is actually Japanese as well. So we've become quite international in our operation unintentionally.
Yeah.
But I think this is what happens when you kind of open the floodgates and you do. You do open yourself up to diversity and open yourself up to, people from underrepresented labor markets. You're just going to end up with people from those places because, there are so many people who are trying to like compete for fewer opportunities that you're just going to get, frankly speaking, you're just going to get better candidates.
Yeah.
Here, like we're like begging people to, apply to our company. Well, I mean, not exactly, but that's what it kind of feels like. Whereas, when you try to look into places where they don't have like large video game presence, they're definitely more excited to hear about what you have to say. And we try to be fair, and we try to make sure that everybody who works for us is fairly compensated. We're an indie company, so nobody's making a ton of money, but we want to make sure that we keep that salary range to be fairly flat. So, the person that's making the most amount of money is not making that much more than the person that's making the least amount of money. Yeah. And that gets extended all to our freelancers as well. We want to make sure that everyone gets a fair share. That's I think those are the things that we really wanted to emphasize in this company, because I think one of the things that that's been kind of demoralizing in our years of working in the games industry is that we've worked on, not just me, but people on our team have worked on some of the the highest selling games in the world, like games that have made, God knows how much money. And none of us are rich. None of us we've never really been able to like get a fair portion of the value that we've created for these companies, because that gets all soaked up by the executives or the shareholders or whoever it is that all that money goes to. But like, it's frustrating when you're working on a game that makes $1 billion or whatever, and that you have coworkers that are like struggling to like make ends meet.
Right.
And we never want to do that. Even if we don't have $1 billion, we want to make sure at least like, the money's going out fairly.
Yeah. And that's great to hear, because from everything you just shared, at the core between, what you have done to help provide, certain services and help and aid and stuff, in addition to the focus of Cuts to Bits, it really, again, focuses on increasing that industry exclusivity. And it's just awesome to hear to those levels. And again, there's a lot of that context and reasoning is so important, and obviously a big driver for this, but also it just as you kind of mentioned, it really happens organically and everything. And just, it seems like a lot of cool things are happening because of it. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. And you definitely alluded to a lot of the things we're going to be talking about as our subject here. But before we do that, I would love for you to have you go into our Q-Box round so we can learn a little bit more about you. And it's just a series of some quick random questions I prepared for you. So, Masao, are you ready for the Q-Box round?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. All right. First, why do you make games?
I think the real reason is I don't really know how to do anything else.
Awesome. Name one thing that motivates you every day.
What motivates me every day? Providing for my family.
Awesome. And then the last and staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
I'm playing Rain World because I never played it, and it's pretty cool. I must say.
I was looking at that the other day, and I was just curious, and I don't know, your response and saying that that's what you're playing now might push me a little bit more towards picking that up. So glad to hear that you're.
It's a very curious game. Like,
yeah.
it's very different in the way that it's made from us, but it's very interesting. I don't want to talk too much about it because I feel like it's one of those games that you really want to discover, and I don't want to the game does very little of explaining itself before you start, and I think it's intentional. So I don't want to give away too many aspects of it, but it's a beautiful game. It's masterfully done. I think it's one of those games that's been around for a while, and the developers have continued to improve it, and you can really tell.
Nice. Well, definitely sounds like one worth checking out. And thank you for sharing those responses with the Q-Box round. And with that done, let's get into the heart of our conversation, which is turbocharging your remote studio's productivity. So why don't we kick this off with talking about, the importance of communication, because, that and sharing a unified vision among a team is definitely a challenge for any studio, especially if it's set up remotely, which you shared already, that's how you guys are now set up. So with that said, how are you guys able to ensure that every team member is on the same page while they're remote?
Well, it's a challenge for sure. And the funny thing is, it's a challenge that's shared across different kinds of contexts as well.
Mm-hmm.
For most of my career, I worked in AAA, and AAA, even on site, has the same exact issue because how do you keep, a team of 500 people on the same page?
Right.
And it's a challenge. I think in our case, it was easier because when we started the project, we had so you know how like I mean different projects start in different ways, but in our case, we were recruited by the creative director saying, "Hey, I want to make this game. Do you want to make it with me?" So he had a fully fleshed out idea. Obviously, things have changed a little bit over the course of the last 4 years of production, but basically the premise of the game and the key elements of the game have always been consistent. He also had a functional prototype because he made a previous version of this game on XNA back in the day that he never finished because Microsoft pulled XNA support before he was able to. Because originally there was a version of this game that was aimed towards Xbox Live Arcade.
Okay.
But so we had a pretty good idea of what we were trying to achieve from the beginning. So it's kind of going from there and moving forward. In terms of making sure that everybody has a good idea of what they're doing is a constant. It's a constant iteration as the team grows and as the needs of the teams change. And I think to make sure that everyone is working at the highest productivity, I think it's important for production management to have kind of that flexible idea and keep on looking at what you're doing. Like you can only improve what you're measuring, and I think that's one of the things that you want to keep an eye on. So, making sure that making sure that like people know what they're doing and they're comfortable and they're secure in their objectives, I think is the most important thing. And I believe in a light touch production. I tried because like my philosophy in terms of production management is that production management is not generative. It's not a part of the game development process that results in actual game development output. Like it's not, you don't make more game because you had more meetings.
Right.
You don't make more game because you had, a Jira ticket that was closed. So I want to make sure that like the production process is scaling to the needs of the team and is has the least amount of impact on the day-to-day operations or the day-to-day activities of the people who are working on the game. And I think in order to ensure that you still have enough, it's there's a constant checking in to make sure that people know what they're doing and they're confidently able to move forward. So I don't know. There was a lot of vague conversations about what I'm doing production wise, but that's kind of what my philosophy is to ensure. And I think that really applies to any kind of team, regardless of whether or not it's remote or in person or, size of the team. I think some production people have this idea that they have a process and they want to implement it and they want to, but if people hate the way that you're managing the project, then you're doing it wrong. If people don't see value in the way that you're managing your project, you're doing it wrong, because either you're not explaining what the value it's bringing, or it's not bringing as much value as you think that it is. So that's kind of, that's generally the approach that I take.
Yeah, no, and it's an interesting one too, because if you think about it, you're right. Remote or not, it doesn't necessarily make the difference. What does is and is having that vision, the process, and monitoring, right? But then you just clearly a moment ago defined, but also being flexible, because if those all things don't align and it doesn't work with team members and stuff, then you're really not working towards productivity. There's more conflict and everything else. So glad you definitely outlined that so well, because it's like anybody can interpret these things different, but to get a little bit more insight about how your process works, and especially regardless of what your work environment is located, whatever, sounds like it makes all the difference and really and helping to ensure productivity. Now, with that said, I'm sure,
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add one more thing? So one more thing that I tried, I do, which I don't know, might be a controversial take, but I don't try to solve problems before there are problems on a
good
production
point.
phase. So I think a lot of times people get very like, I mean, I'm naturally a fairly anxious person, so I try to solve problems before they're problems. But specifically in the area of production, like I won't schedule a meeting. Like for example, like I won't schedule a regular meeting for a subject until until it has been observed that not having that meeting is a problem. Because I think it's very easy to kind of get into this like preemptive state where you just schedule like reviews all over the place and like syncs all over the place. And then now you look at your calendar and it's filled with meetings. And I think especially on a smaller project, that is a huge productivity killer. So I will not schedule a meeting unless something is observed to be a problem or somebody brings up that, you know, it's a problem. I'm not going to like, if somebody comes to me and say, hey, I have this problem, I'm not going to like be like, no, we're not going to address that. But yeah, I let things, you know, and again, I'm not saying that let the problem get worse or, you know, let a problem kind of, you know, fester. But I do try to kind of let people do their own thing until I feel that I need to intervene. It's kind of like, I think in some ways it's kind of like parenting. Like, you know, you don't want to solve all your kids' problems because then they're not going to solve problems on their own. And I think, you know, game development is also like that. Like if the solution is two people need to talk, like the best way for them to deal with that is to actually just for them to, you know, understand that they need to talk and they talk.
Yep.
I think scheduling a meeting saying like, okay, you know, I need to make sure that you're talking at this this interval is kind of, you know, it's the less good version of that version of that solution. So I think as much as possible, I try to let people, you know, work organically together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, I think your example, at least for those of us who are parents, and I'm sure everybody can relate to it in some way, shape, or form, is a great one, because it's like you just try to do everything all the time for your kids. They're never going to learn. They're never going to be self-sufficient or, you know, independent and all these other things. And the same principle applies to trying to handhold everyone else's hand throughout the same time, because it's not going to be to the point that maybe you would, from a producer standpoint, need them to be, you know, autonomous and everything else, and to make their own decisions and factors like that. And then it kills your time on top of that. So really interesting insights that you shared there. And, you know, I'm sure with those types of situations and others, I'm sure, I would imagine that there's always been some type of challenges and everything else with that. Now, you know, you've shifted over. Originally, you were you started out as like a locally based studio, and then made the shift over to remote. When that happened, when that transition happened, what were some of the initial challenges that you faced moving to remote?
So, so the first thing that happened for us was the COVID lockdown. So basically, we went from a local studio that was all in person to a local studio that was now all work from home. And that wasn't really a choice. It was, legally mandated.
Right.
Quebec had a pretty strict lockdown for a while. So we weren't even allowed to leave our house unless it was to go to the grocery store or the pharmacy, and non-essential businesses weren't even allowed to operate.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, so I was still allowed to come here because we had a server. At the time, we didn't have we had like an actual computer that was a server, and somebody, I was legally allowed to be here because I had to make sure that server was running. But
Yep.
so that was considered to be like an essential operation of the business. But pretty much everybody else was not allowed to come here. Not that everyone, and in the beginning of the pandemic, nobody was nobody was trying to get in line to get in a, working in person. We weren't, we're fairly reasonable people, but, so yeah, that was kind of the challenge to figure out well, how do we do this? How do we do this online? And there was some physical challenges okay, well, do we want to keep this server? That's this physical server, which we now, I guess all servers are physical at some point, but now we have a cloud server service that we work with, and that's much better for us because the download and upload time to that server is much higher than having to connect to a computer that's sitting in the office.
Right.
And we also don't have to worry about is the power out?
Right. Exactly.
Can somebody drive to the studio to turn the server back on? Stuff like that. And then there was also issues of okay, well, how do we kind of maintain a way of working where, because I think the thing about remote is that you have a risk of both not having enough communication and having too much communication, where people feel like they're being constantly interrupted.
That's interesting.
Because game development, you want to be in that kind of flow state where you're solving your problems and you're you're in the groove. So the approach that we took is that we schedule, we have a sync meeting on Monday and Friday. Monday to say okay, well, this is our stand up, this is what I'm going to be working on this week. And then Friday, here are my results. And then beyond that, we have 3 2-hour meetings that we schedule Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And basically the way we call those meetings co-working sessions. And basically at the beginning of the meeting, everybody shows up and say hey, does anybody need me for anything? And if nobody says yes, then you're free to go. But if somebody does need your help, that's the opportunity that we take to kind of work together. So that way, if you have a non-urgent need, we have that opportunity to say to raise your hand and be hey, I need your help with this, which I think solves the issue of people being interrupted when they're working on their things, and also people feeling they're bothering people when they're reaching out for people. And obviously you're still allowed to, reach out to people, especially if you have urgent needs, or if you're hey, I just want to have this question I have to ask. And we work primarily on Discord. All of our stuff happens over Discord. So, we just talk to each other and have those touch points that we know okay, well, I need help with this, but it's not urgent. Then you still, or I need help with this, but it's going to take more than 5 minutes. It's going to be a 2-hour thing. That's you're going to have a good opportunity to do that every other day. And I think that's been really, I think, a productive thing to do. We also have a weekly play session where we either play our game or play some other game. And I think that helps with kind of building kind of a sense of team, which I think is harder to kind of cultivate in the context of a remote studio.
Yeah. In those two last points you shared about those types of meetings, how they're able to kind of like set expectations for everybody else and whatnot, and also the kind of that team building, if you will, with the play sessions. It really goes into, I think, in a way, making sure that things are on point, but also being healthy. So it sounds like those are some ways, but are there anything else that you're considering or trying to do to just ensure that your team is, productive, while also being healthy with their work habits? Because, being remote, you can easily just say, oh, I'm just going to do this one thing. And next thing you know, you're working into, odd hours of the night because you're just at your desk, you're in that groove. So I guess what kind of things are you doing to make sure that productivity is still happening, but people are still being healthy in terms of what that work-life balance looks like?
We're an indie studio with a lot of co-founders who have stake in the company. So unfortunately, I think sometimes we definitely do go off the rails when it comes to healthy work-life balance. But I think one of the main things is we try to lead by example. We take time off. We tell people to not work in the weekends. We tell people to not work in the evenings. And we, as much as possible, when we notice that people are like checking in at all hours of the night, we tell them to cut it out. I think it is a tricky thing because like one of the things that we do is that we have no core working hours. We have like specific touch points that we expect people to show up to, but like for example, one of our team members has chronic insomnia, and basically he can only really sleep well, like he generally sleeps well. Like I think that the time that he seems to be able to consistently sleep is like 8 a.m. to noon.
Okay.
So like he typically rolls in the afternoon and tends to work later than everybody else. And initially we're like, is this working for us? But in the end, I think it makes the most sense to be flexible because like he's great at what he does, and he's trying to best manage his health and his his issues, and we want to make sure that we're being accommodating to that because it's not like he wants to do that. Like it's not like
Right.
he so it would be crazy for us to like essentially punish him because he's not fitting into the 9 to 5 that we that society says that we're supposed to do. So we do very much leave it up to the individual to make sure that you are taking care of yourself. But I think we have these conversations frequently, and I think more than anything, I think setting expectations and leading by example is, I think, one of the more important things when it comes to work-life balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And really great examples there on how to go about doing that, especially on the flexibility side. But I also really appreciate, the honesty too, from, a co-founder's perspective of, sometimes that happens, but at the very least, we do want to, lead by example and everything, because it just carries over into, all aspects of the project, of the company, and everything else. So I want to shift things a little bit here real quick. Earlier you mentioned, hey, we have team members all across the world, internationally, whatever. And, having access to that, wider talent pool is definitely, I'm sure, a game changer, as you said. But like that said, like what were some of the challenges did this pose as well, having this level of access?
I think that was well, it's kind of the reverse. Like this isn't really a challenge. It was kind of a solution. Like
Interesting.
our issue was that like we couldn't hire locally. Montreal is a big gaming hotspot, and there's a lot of jobs here. And now increasingly, people here are being recruited to work remotely for West Coast studios that have like really high salaries, and we just can't compete as a lowly indie. Like, you know, the kind of salaries that we can offer are just not attractive to even to juniors in Montreal. So, you know, basically we're like, okay, well, how do we find people who want to work on our project and make, you know, like our starting salary is not bad. Like we offer $50,000 Canadian, which for Montreal standards is you know very reasonable. And but like that is just not enough for certain types of profile anymore. And you know, and I'm happy for my you know the fellow members of our community who you know are again like you know how are able to you know make a good living making video games. But we were like, okay, well, what do we do? So we just started looking at different markets, basically. You know, and we started doing recruiting. We recruit through work with indies a lot. They're a great job post site, and then we basically say worldwide, you know, worldwide remote opportunity. This is our salary range. You know, come and work for us if you're interested. Yeah. With the exchange rate, it's really difficult to work with people in the United States right now because, you know, the Canadian dollar doesn't go very far at the moment. But, you know, when we're looking at people who are coming from places that have lower cost of living, like South America or, you know, certain parts of Europe, our salaries are competitive. So I think that's kind of how we've kind of adapted to this new kind of remote focus international labor type of world.
Yeah. And I find it interesting, but it makes complete sense, especially with how you outlined it, where it's like, hey, we were in this position where we were forced basically to not have you know, the level of access, whether it's the environment because of how competitive it is with that talent pool in, you know, Montreal or even in certain parts of the world, but also, you know, just having that really expanding things, any other, let's say, challenges that could have come up, like you mentioned, like the exchange rate or even with like, say, I don't know much about filing, government filing or whatnot in Canada, but like let's say if there's certain withholding that you have to do with working with people over in other countries, at the end of the day, like you said outright, it's really just was the solution. And I think it sounds like it just outweighs anything else that could have been a challenge and just like essentially little hurdles that you just had to overcome. But the long run was way more beneficial than the alternative or other options that might have been present. So really interesting to hear that, and a great way to kind of look at it differently too, because at the end of the day, you're trying to just solve these problems and this solution, and having a wider talent pool is definitely a big one. So,
yeah. I mean, ultimately, we just want to work with people who are excited about us and, you know, excited about the team, excited about the game. And, you know, that's just kind of what we've been doing.
Yeah. And that's so important too, leading with that type of intent, because you want to work with people that are excited for these things and excited to work with you guys and stuff, of course. Now, let's shift things a little bit more. Let's really talk about how we can maximize productivity. So, because of the shift to remote, were there certain things that you needed to update, like systems? And if so, like how were you able to identify what those were in order to increase productivity and such? Because I know you outlined some of what your process was before, but in general, but were there any other things that needed to change because of going to remote?
I think some of the things that we've implemented recently, so I mean, other than what we've already discussed, I think one of the biggest challenges that people aren't talking about too much about remote is what do you do with juniors? Because I think it's very difficult to kind of onboard and train juniors in a remote context. I think before, when you were all in the same place, it was much easier for, you know, the juniors to kind of absorb things that they see, or, you know, being able to kind of like walk over to someone and ask them a question and get help. And I think that's why, like, increasingly, or ever since the pandemic started, like, we've seen just a decrease of junior positions and internships. So one of the things that we've recently implemented is a buddy system. So the level artists now are working in pairs. Like, before, we had like 4 separate artists working on 4 separate maps. And now we've instead now have paired up the two, paired up the artists to one with more experience and one with less experience, and they work on the map together.
Okay.
And I think being able for them to like work together, I think is having a really positive impact on kind of keeping the junior on task and focusing on the things that need to be done, but also at the same time, them having access to someone that can help them, grow and learn more about how to do their job.
Interesting. Now, this what you just shared, I think definitely relates to this question too, in terms of like, ways to scale your business and essentially like free up time. Are there any other things that you've found that have been able to help you do that with this kind of now with this new? It's been a few years now, but with this remote setup, like are there other things that you have found that allow you to help scale and free up some time, whether it's you, other co-founders, or just any other team member?
I mean, I don't think making video games in a remote context is that different than making video games. I think things that help in remote context are generally things that help in any context. Like, for example, having good documentation, having, precise tasking and tracking of tasks, having clear, production pipelines, having clear ideas on dependencies. These are all things that help in any video game context. I don't feel that making video games in remote context is significantly different, like at least from a nuts and bolts standpoint, than on site. There are certain things that are trickier. For example, like I think one of the things that we had a hard time kind of nailing down was like player feels. How do you, like being able to like, because the thing is, if you're trying to figure out if you want to figure out how this jump is supposed to feel, and you have one person working on a computer, changing the variables, and then being able to like pass the controller to, to the different people to say like, well, do you like this? What do you think? Is still very difficult to do in a remote context, because the thing about like, we still have no real good solution for low latency, like screen sharing. Like people use different kinds of ways to be able to like to do screen sharing and like be able to play on someone's build type of thing. But at the end of the day, when you're trying to like feel the difference of like fraction of a second, any latency basically kind of kills that.
Right. Yep.
So there are things that are just difficult and just take more time, and you just kind of have to accept, because now you basically, one person basically is like, okay, well, I think I got it to the best that I can. And then you upload that build, everybody downloads that build and plays that build and has feedback. So now like this thing that could have taken 5 seconds in person takes 45 minutes, 15 minutes in terms of like a single feedback loop, which sucks, but is life. But majority of game development is not like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I was going with this, but
I mean, that's fine. But it still boils back to, I think the main point you led with is, I mean, hey, there might be like little things that can kind of scale things a little bit differently. But for the most part, it's those core concepts that, kind of really apply across the board. So if you're looking to scale or, free up some more time, having those systems, understandings, expectations, whatever you may set, you call it, in place are really the areas that are going to be scaling things. It doesn't necessarily differ that much between local or remote.
Yeah, resilient businesses are going to be able to, scale a lot easier than the ones that are not. And I think that's, that's just how it is, remote or not. You have a strong business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Work with people who you trust, and work with, have processes that are independent from people. I think, yeah. If you rely on a person to be able to like, if your business runs because you have a specific person, then like you're going to have a hard time scaling.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of true regardless of, so you try to have processes and documentation and all of that is independent of all the individuals. Obviously, we're not robots. We're not just pieces of a machine. People make an organization. However, you try to make the processes as much as people agnostic as possible. That way, you do have the ability to scale. You do have the ability for people to have flexibility, and you do have ability for people to take time off. So I think that's the key approach.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And before we close here, I want to ask us one other question. And, earlier on, you definitely alluded to it. But like, what were some of the interesting benefits that you saw that came from going remote that you might not necessarily, were expecting? Like anything, like in terms of maybe the culture or the makeup of your team. Like, what were some interesting things that came out of getting remote team members?
This is a very personal one, but I really appreciate the peace and quiet.
Yeah.
Like for most of my career, I worked in very large studios with lots and lots of people, and it's extremely noisy and a lot of stuff going on. And I am easily distracted by noise and then movement. And I think going remote and having, no longer being in a room with a bunch of people has definitely helped in terms of productivity for me. Yeah, especially when you're trying to do things like record a podcast or make a video on TikTok. It's definitely nice when you don't have to worry about somebody shouting in the background.
Definitely. Um, and what about, and just for some quick context, I know we talked briefly before this interview um, around this subject, and I know that you shared an interesting story about kind of the art that was incorporated into the game, where it was very like some of the elements or details of some of the art that was used was very specific, and something that basically that artist brought kind of a little of their own personal touch from where they're based. Could you share that? Because when you were sharing that with me, that was a really
Oh
interesting
yeah, yeah.
story.
So we have this kind of secret area that is like this that our NPC has like kind of an occult basement where they're doing spooky things. And yeah, like we kind of gave the brief and and the artist started working on it, and she's from Mexico. And and the funny thing is, like, we didn't specifically give her that instruction, but when she completed the the room, it looked very yeah, it had like this like very like Mexican flavor to it. Like there's like a little altar that looks like something that you would see uh, in in that like in that Mexican context. Like there's like a desk that looks like an ofrenda. Like there's a and it was kind of funny because that wasn't specifically our feedback, but to kind of and I think that's the cool thing, you know, when you have people from around the world kind of contributing to the game, that you get these like kind of local flavors that wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for the fact that you're working with people from different parts of the world. And I think that that is definitely something that's neat that is coming from working in this kind of context.
Yeah, and I always like that story because, I mean, it's just one example of, I'm sure, many can see where how just different perspectives can add that much more extra value that that you probably wouldn't have seen otherwise if it was very super hyper focused and detailed in terms of what that execution looked like, and not leading with the level of flexibility that can just create a lot of very interesting different things, to the point where it just that just carries over so much value into the final product of the game, where not having that flexibility in place maybe not doesn't quite add to that overall experience that's so different and memorable and everything else like that. So appreciate you sharing that story, because it's a really interesting one, and definitely a benefit, I would say, that comes with this international culture that you guys have. Now, we're running on time here, but before we close, I'd love for you to share, a few tips or suggestions that you have for our listeners today based on what we discussed.
Uh, I think the tip that I really want to share is to go out there and look for, ask people for help. I think for years I thought like I'm just supposed to figure things out on my own. And I think in especially in the context where, especially in the context of indie, where I don't have other people in the company whose job it is to help me, I've had to find people who can. And I think, generally people are helpful, and they are, people want to help other people for the most part. And I think being out there and being open for that, and being and also helping other people, puts you in contact of in of these communities where you can help each other. And I think that's one of the most important things, especially in the context of indie, to make sure that you're going out there and trying not to solve all of your problems alone. find your peers and try to discuss how you can move forward.
Yeah, because it's very scary doing it all yourself, doing it all alone, and just
And you won't, and let's be honest, the likelihood that you will come up with an optimal solution to a problem is low compared to like if you ask a group of people who have already done that.
right.
Somebody somewhere has solved that problem already.
Yeah.
And we'll have a solution that is more graceful than whatever you had in mind. Or not. Maybe you have this, like you came up with the best solution. But if that's the case, then you should share it with other people as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, how many times have we talked out something with someone else to find that just that process, just that interaction, engagement with someone else was enough for figuring out that problem, right? Even if you did it on your own, it was that environment, that situation that really helped promote that thinking. Whereas,
yeah, I mean, in programming, there's the concept of rubber ducking, right? Like, have you heard about this?
I have not.
Okay, so the idea is that you imagine like you can have a physical one, but you imagine holding a rubber duck and explaining whatever you're trying to do to that duck. And in the process of explaining it, you kind of solve your own problems because you have to express it as a full thought. You're having to kind of fill in the gaps. So sometimes talking about your problem with yourself is sufficient. Is even better. Is going to give you a better implementation of what you would have done without that. So, I mean, if you have another person that also knows stuff, then that's great. Like that's even better. But yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah, no, it's cool. And while it's a little bit different, years ago I was a writing tutor at my college. And it was just so funny how sometimes people are trying to improve their paper, right? And then all that it came down to is asking them this simple question, which you could easily apply to what you just shared with the rubber ducking, is that, well, what are you really trying to say? And then they would say it, and it's like, then write that. Sometimes that's how these things work out. But really interesting concept and stuff. But I mean, back to your point, get out there, ask people for help. It's like you said, they're going to have a lot of ideas or at least know of what that solution is instead of you trying to just spin your wheels and figuring out for yourself. Again, there you go. Some other ways to be more productive with your time. Just getting a little assistance sometimes can go a long way. Well, so can't thank you enough. This is so insightful with everything that you shared. And, for anyone listening today that want to connect with you or find out more about your studio and Venture to Vial, what are some links and what are some ways that our listeners can do that?
You can follow me on Twitter at Mega Masao at Twitter. I also have a TikTok, also Mega Masao. If you're interested in our game, the Twitter handle is Cut to Bits. We also have a TikTok account for the game, which is again Cut to Bits. And if you want to follow our game, it's Venture to the Vial, and you can find that on Steam.
Awesome. Well, again, can't thank you enough for being on here with us today. And folks, check those things out. Great ways to connect and find out more about Venture Vial. And again, remember, there most likely will be on Kickstarter live.
Oh yes, yeah, the Kickstarter. We're I forgot to mention this, but so the Kickstarter is actually not for the game. The Kickstarter is the comic book that is the companion to the game. And we are working, we're working with award-winning comic book artists from all around the world including Carl Kerschel, Andy Belanger, Sweeney Boo, Margaret Savage, Subversive Girl. Like, we have like an amazing roster of artists that are working on this. So check out the Kickstarter at it's Venture to the Vial. It's a great comic book. It's going to be a great comic book. So go check it out.
Awesome. Well, folks, check those things out. And Masao, can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing how to improve your productivity wherever you may be.
Thanks.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.